Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here for our Science and Policy webinar with SAAPHI, the Society for the Analysis of African American Public Health Issues. My name is Dr. Sandy Hogan. I am President-elect and co-chair for the Science and Policy Committee, and I'm really excited about this opportunity to share this webinar with you with Dr. Jackson. I will start with just a few housekeeping. Again, if you are on a line and you're at work, if you could refrain from placing us on hold so we don't have to listen to your hold music. If you need to mute your line, you can press *6. If you need to unmute yourself, you can press #6. And that's that. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Jackson. Chazeman Jackson is a senior science policy analyst and the lead for the National Institutes of Health portfolio within the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, Office of Science and Data Policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In this capacity, Dr. Jackson advises office leadership and other senior HHS decision makers in planning, coordinating, and evaluating a broad range of biomedical research, science policy, budgetary, and legislative issues. In June of 2016, Dr. Jackson joined ASPE with more than 10 years of health science research and administration experience, having most recently served as the Health Science Advisor in the Office of Minority Health at Health and Human Services. Prior to joining HHS in 2010, as an Emerging Leaders Fellow, she earned her PhD in microbiology from Howard University. She holds a Master's of Arts in Biology from American University and a BA in Humanities with an emphasis in philosophy from Tuvalu College. In recognition of her achievements and commitment to science-based policies, Dr. Jackson was selected in 2009 as Christine Mirzan Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the Institute of Medicine Roundtable in the promotion of health equity and the elimination of health disparities. Dr. Jackson's career passion is to bridge her scientific acumen with the development and implementation of policies that advance the nation's health. And without further ado, I am happy to welcome Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson?
Thank you, Dr. Hogan, and thank you all for joining today's call, and I appreciate the opportunity to present, and I look forward to our discussion. If you could advance to my slide. And so I wanted to make a quick note as we begin. The title of the session was What is Policy? And I'm going to focus today's talk on science policy. And in the field, there tends to be a bit of discussion about the differences of public policy and science policy. So throughout the slides, I will highlight some of the general public policy issues and then also be able to pinpoint the specificity of science policy. For some of the science policy issues which would make or which some believe are different from general public policy issues include the rapid changes in science and technology, the complexity and novelty of scientific issues, and really science's ability to address real and imagined threats to human health and safety. If we can advance to the next slide. Next slide. All right, do I have control? Dr. Hogan?
Sorry about that. I'm not sure why. Technical difficulties. I apologize. Okay, let's see here.
Well, it did skip one slide, but you can keep it there. I just wanted to mention that I do have a disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in my presentation are not official policies are positions of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or my office, the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. The slide number 3, which if you all note for the presentation, I've provided a handout of the slides. If we have any other technical difficulty and would like to follow along. Slide number 3, which talks about what is science policy. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development defines science policy as such, which is the quote on this slide. Science policy is concerned with the allocation of resources for scientific research and technical development. It includes government encouragement of science and technology as the roots of strategy for industrial development and economic growth. And it also includes the use of science in connection with problems of public sector. This definition really positions us to look at the relationship between science and policymaking. So I want you to look at 2 ends. Consider it right hand, left hand. One perspective is policy for science. Policy for science is really concerned with the allocation of resources for the encouragement of scientific research and development. Examples of that would be, should the U.S. government support embryonic stem cell research? Policy for science really influences the decision-making regarding how to fund, structure, and govern the pursuit of knowledge. The other hand is science for policy. Science for policy is using scientific knowledge to enhance the nation's response to societal or public challenges. So a question would be, should the U.S. take action on climate change? So there's an action as it relates to the relationship of science for policy. Science is there informing policy by the use of scientific knowledge in the decision-making process. Here I'll point out, different from science policy, public policy in general is defined as a federal plan of action that's adopted by Congress and signed into law by the President. The next slide. So the next slide points out a few historical aspects of U.S. science policy. I would argue that the Constitution is an example of some of the first formal science policy decisions that have occurred in our country. For example, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, empower Congress to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing limited time to authorities and inventors the exclusive rights of their respective writings and discoveries. That may sound very familiar because it's our current day patent office. Moving forward in time, in the early 1800s, President Thomas Jefferson requests from Congress $2,500 to finance the Lewis and Clark expedition. Many of us recall through the lens of American history Lewis and Clark expedition, but few of us recognize as a part of President Jefferson's budget, there were scientific instruments included as a part of the budget as well as weaponry. So in terms of the expedition, it also was supposed to yield scientific discovery and adventure of the Far West. One thing to note, prior to World War II, there were no well-defined U.S. strategy for science. Following World War II, there was a director for the White House Office of Scientific Research and Development. His name was Dr. Vannevar Bush. And Dr. Bush was a well-respected engineer and science administrator who was really a consultant to President Roosevelt. And he had the ear of the president. And so he wrote a report which is titled Science, the Endless Frontier. And this has become considered foundational document for modern-day U.S. science policy. This report really described a peacetime role for science. The report, it was set out to really advise the relationship that the federal government would have with the scientific community. In the report, Bush indicates that scientific progress was essential for both the war against disease, national security, and for the public welfare. The report then went on to recommend that the federal government would undertake responsibilities for renewing the nation's scientific talent. To respond to these needs, Bush proposed a new federal agency that would, quote, accept new responsibilities for promoting the flow of new scientific knowledge and the development of scientific talent of youth. This recommendation eventually became the National Science Foundation. The next slide, please. So understanding a little bit about U.S. science policy and the history, what it means, the next logical question would be who influences science policy? Science policy emerges from the center of a complex web of actors who have a variety of mechanisms to use influence on science policy. Now, from my experience, the best solutions have often been those that balance the concerns and interests of all parties rather than completely satisfying one interest group. But I use this slide to highlight the diversity of the different players. You'll note from the slide several organizations or entities. One you may recognize, Federal Advisory Committee. Other examples include the National Academies. Other examples include the public and the press. So not to go through a laundry list, but wanting to highlight the important role and influence of policy think tanks, professional organizations, discipline societies, universities, industry, trade associations, and the individual. On the next slide, which is titled Science Policy, I wanted to focus our discussion particularly on the role of science policy in the federal government. So I've broken down in this table the three branches of government, the executive, congressional, and judiciary, and then postulate of types of mechanisms or strategies by which science policy is influenced. In the executive branch, you'll recognize veto authority, budget, OMB, which is Office of Management and Budget circulators. In the congressional side, you will see laws, bills, budget appropriation, oversight, approval of political appointees. And then in the judicial branch, you'll see an important mechanism and role, which is the interpretation of laws and determine the constitutionality of those laws. On the next slide. So we have science policy, the players, the definition, the branches of government, federal government that influence the process. But I wanted to have as a take-home message that it's certainly not a straightforward process. And there are some general assumptions, and these are particular assumptions in the science policy space. One, rigorous scientific research yields solid evidence. Several of you are researchers, scientists, practitioners, and we know from ourselves rigorous research doesn't always or doesn't necessitate that we have solid evidence. Sometimes there's no evidence, sometimes there's weaker evidence. But this is an assumption oftentimes in the process. Another assumption is that evidence is easily accessible to policymakers. Well, as I showed in the previous slide of influencers, you would imagine that all of the influencers have different types of evidence that they are presenting as an argument for policymakers. And that accessibility can come through different vehicles. Another assumption is that policymakers actually use the evidence to create policy. And an example of how we know that policy isn't just a straightforward process as researchers and in sciences is the publication to policy ratio, which still remains quite low. On the next slide, continuing with our recognition that it's not a straightforward policy making, it's not a straightforward process, I've included here a few factors that influence that process. And I'll credit this to an author, Mendane, a 2001 article, which talks about the different factors that influence the process. And Mendane quotes 3 areas, one being public priorities, and that is how many people are affected, does the general public see this as an important issue, media coverage, how noteworthy is this topic, is it predominantly described in broadcast or news outlets, and lastly, the relevance of the topic or the policy to the political majority. Is this on the political majority's platform? The next slide is really something near and dear to me, and what I currently do in my role is policy analysis. So policy analysis is actually an academic discipline, and in this area, I'm focusing more on the general area of public policy and not specific to the science policy. As a discipline, it's defined as a systematic method of thinking about the design, development, and assessment of public policy. And it's broken into 2 major areas, analysis of and analysis for. Analysis of policy is analytical and descriptive. It attempts to explain policies and their development. Analysis for policy is very prescriptive. It involves formulating policies and proposals. And to highlight just a few of steps in the policy analysis on this slide, one, I've noted you have to define and analyze policy. 2, articulate relevant decision-making criteria for policymaking. And 3, evaluate different policy options or solutions. And lastly, assess the means, cost of implementation. In some spaces, it's often worded as assessing the impact. I think that as a good analyst, it's important to approach the problem as a generalist and then bring in more specific information from different areas when you're analyzing. The next slide is talking about, in the academic discipline of policy analysis, the models of policy analysis. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. These are a couple that I wanted to just highlight. In science policy and pretty much in most levels of government, the rational model is used. And the rational model is like scientific analysis to solve political problems that are faced by decision makers. You would approach it from a scientific method, and that you would analyze it even if the process is very messy. The incremental model is really focusing on, it's the alternative to rational modeling, but it's looking at policy as an evolution. And and I've cited here, if you're interested in further reading, the developer of this model, Lindblom, wrote an article, a classic article in 1959 called The Science of Muddling Through. So the incremental model may sometimes in political circles or policy circles is often referred to as the muddling through process. You're taking small changes to generate larger base changes down the line. So it's not a revolutionary process, it's an evolutionary process. And the last model I'll highlight is the elite model. And this really suggests that the general public are ill-informed and that elites are actually shaping the mass opinion of policy questions and that government acts in according to those suggestions. The next slide is a more thorough breakdown of the process of policy analysis, which was developed by a professor at UC Berkeley, Dr. Eugene Bardock, and it's called the eightfold method. That method starts with the nature and scope of the problem. So what are the undesired social, political, economic consequences that you want to address in the policy? Number two is assembling evidence or collecting evidence to document that problem exists. I know in my experience and time that I spent working in minority health and health disparities, a lot of policymakers and decision makers and researchers in that space spent several years really just on this step alone of collecting evidence that would document that disparities did exist. Number three is identification of alternatives. And this is looking through a lens of understanding the advantages and disadvantages and thinking of what should be the focal point of action. Should this be state? Should this be federal? Should this be local? Should this be Congress? The next is selecting criteria. And these criteria can vary between effectiveness, cost, public acceptance, what are the risks, and the next step in the eightfold path is to project outcomes. And normally, most leadership styles in the policy process would like to know what could happen if I choose to go this way. So the more alternatives that are accurate and built on facts that you can present really does help in terms of your criteria and the strength of your policy. The next is to assess trade-offs between your alternatives. And this could look like, does the current policy need to be totally replaced? Can it be strengthened? Does it need to be refined? Is there public acceptance? Is there congressional acceptance? So really examining what would you be trading off through the criteria that you have established. And the next to the last step is to make a decision. And this you would think is obvious, but it's not always so obvious. So making a decision based on the previous steps is a critical point in the process. And then lastly, just as critical, is to tell your story so that it can be understood. The next slide, we're on slide 12. Yes. I thought it would be helpful to talk about the background of science policy and the academic discipline of public policy in general, but I also want you to appreciate that it's a people. That policy analysis and policy implementation is a people process. And so what skills would be helpful in being successful in policy analysis? And these are just to name a few. Humility, flexibility, being able to negotiate, having integrity in the process, and organization, but most certainly being able to effectively write and orally communicate the policy. as you saw earlier, there's so many, since it's not a straightforward process, there's so many players that being able to communicate, and communication is critical. The next slide, I wanted to highlight the application of those skills. I trained as a basic scientist or lab scientist and have spent the last 10 years working in an administrative and policy space. And so on this slide, I wanted to compare the best of both worlds. So the concept is really the space of where I live now in policy, in administration, public health, and then implementation gives more of the lens of how I traditionally have viewed research and science. So the concept of investing in data and information. I liken that to research and evaluation. Identifying unstated matters of concern. I liken that in a science space of creating theories and hypotheses. Supporting mission and organizational success. I liken that as partnership, teamwork, collaboration. Finding the right way to communicate a message. In a scientific and research space, that could be translated as publications, reports, and briefs. And then the concept of that everyone may not be thinking like you, or no one may be thinking like you, is embracing diversity and having diversity both in experiences but also in academic disciplines as well. And slide number 14, I wanted to highlight some resources in case people are interested in engaging in the process. These are free resources and they're nonpartisan, which a lot of times is encouraged to be really a good analyst is to be neutral and to let the facts and evidence lead your ultimate decision making, especially when you're advising that will have an impact on a broader public. So you see listed here the legislative councils. There are offices of legislative councils in both the House and the Senate, and the legislative offices, they understand the members' policy preferences in order to implement the preferences in a legislative language. Also, I've highlighted the Congressional Budget Office. You may have heard about them a lot lately in the news. And the CBO is an independent agency that analyzes bills and law from the budgetary and economic perspective, and they support the congressional budget process. The Congressional Research Service is also independent, and it provides policy and legal analysis, and they have tons of reports for over decades that will provide information and background when you're investigating a particular question. And then lastly, the General Accountability Office, GAO, it's also independent and nonpartisan agency, and it supports by making sure that performance and the application or implementation of laws are accountable to the American public. And the next slide is what I'm defining as an encore. It's such the intersection of both science, policy, and society. With March coming to an end and also being Women's History Month, I wanted to acknowledge and pay tribute to Mrs. Henrietta Lack. Some of you, or many of you may know her story. She's a woman who had a tremendous and profound impact on biology, although not a scientist. Because of her, we have cures and treatments from a variety of different diseases. And as just a snippet of her story is that her cells, which are now referred to as HeLa cells, were taken from her cervix months before she died. and became the first human cells to grow in culture indefinitely and are often described as immortal. Yet neither her or her family was consulted when the cell samples were taken. Now, where does policy come into play? In, I think it was 2014, the National Institutes of Health, in consultation with the Lax family, established for the first time a policy requiring researchers to apply for access to the full genome sequence data from HeLa cells. The understanding that was reached with the Lax family honors the scientific progress, but it also honors the enormous contribution of the cells from Mrs. Lax. The next slide is just my contact information, and I welcome any questions that you may have after the presentation, but also the next slide is giving us an opportunity to have a discussion and to address any comments or questions that you may have now. And that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. At this time, as Dr. Jackson has mentioned, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. There's also a chat box where you can also ask questions via the chat feature if if for whatever reason you don't want to ask a question outright. I'm happy to ask the question and get the answer for you. Can't tell if my phone is muted. And if you are muted, remember star 6 or pound 6 to unmute yourself. Let's see. There's a question here. Hello? I see someone has asked a question, but all I see is Dr. Jackson's name. Oh, there it is. Sorry. So aside from on-the-job training and experience, what are some ways to increase proficiency in public policy?
So I don't know if this question is coming from someone who's inside government or someone who works outside of the government. So I'll phrase my response in both ways. For those who have who work within the federal government, there are some online training courses through I can't remember the name right now. Well, I guess it's specific to HHS, but they have introductory courses provided by HHS, but I think that there are also some courses that are provided by the Georgetown Institute. There are some courses that the National Academy offers, and I would suggest, for one, the federal budget process is an important source of information to really get a grasp of public policy in general. The budget, as it's created and going through legislative process, really gives a lens around priorities. It also shows or can describe to the extent what is there and what's not there. So it really is a helpful tool to understand what the federal budget process is. And I think that there are a couple of different agencies that provide it. Some provide it for free as a tool of understanding, but then there may be some that are available for purchase. And I can actually provide Dr. Hogan, look into that to provide Dr. Hogan Hogan some resources. Besides training and the on the job training and some of these online courses, I would also recommend participation in some of the professional societies. So, for example, many professional societies have advocacy components, like the APHA or the AAAS, and they also will engage in helping researchers, scientists, and practitioners be more aware of how policies in their specific fields can be learned or even how to be an influencer in that process.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson, thank you for your presentation. What direction do you see public policy going given the current political climate? Do you see more public policy at the state level?
From my own experiences, I've always saw that policy was local. That there's no one size fit all. So you have people who are activated on local and state levels that are really trying to address the needs of their specific communities. I think it's going to continue to be a very interactive, public policy will continue to be a very interactive process. And the slide that I showed about influencers, I think that influencers may not only increase but may diversify. So things that we may not have traditionally seen, like social movements may be circle added to that group of influencers. Social media or digital media may also be a contributor to the broader public policy process. So I think that it's not limited to levels of government, whether it's federal, state, or local. I think it's really going to be a more interactive process with additional influencers and more diverse influencers.
I have a question. Hello?
Sure, by all means. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, great. I have a really quick question. I'm curious to know what rubric you would take or what approach you would take to determine when you have enough scientific evidence gathered to create a call to action to policymakers to actually develop and implement a policy on a particular public health matter.
That's a great question. It really boils down to how much evidence is enough evidence to act. And for me, I try to balance one by ensuring that my first question is that I have all of the right input. So, for example, if I'm trying to figure out whether vaccination should be required, well, my approach to that would be I would want to know the state of science, like on vaccination, and that could be including someone who's a clinician who's actually implementing or giving vaccination. That can include the basic science of what is the vaccine. It can include the insurer, where it's saying how much this is going to cost. So making sure for my first step would be making sure that all of the input across that spectrum is included in whether I am developing this or making a recommendation about the policy. And then the next step of ensuring that after I have the input is to look at the outcome. And I would try to include scale. So I would look at whether as an outcome it's going to have more benefit than harm. I would also look at questions like whether it's going to affect 100 or it's going to affect 1,000, and all of these types of questions really will be specific to the scenario. I'm just giving a kind of a case in point of the way that I would think about that approach. And even if you go back to the slide around the eightfold, I see science in each of those perspectives. So the nature of defining the problem, there's science in identifying what are the real problems. You know, for example, you may have an investigation or a survey of questions to even figure out what our community needs. That's to me a scientific approach to a step in the policy process. So to answer your question, it definitely would be, I think, specific to each scenario, but if your ultimate outcome is to solve a societal issue or a challenge or problem, then if it solves it and it has an impact, then you work backwards from that. And what information do you need to get to that resolution? It's not doing it for science's sake. It really is using science as a tool.
Thank you. And I can appreciate particularly that point about using science as a tool. I think many of us work in settings where it's appropriate that we're able to kind of translate what we do in practice or in research into practical settings. And I think policy is an important part, particularly in public health in that space. So I definitely appreciate that perspective. Another question that we have is, how should faculty preparing entry-level public health professionals, NPH and DRPH, guide students who may want field experience opportunities in policy analysis?
So your question is, how can faculty support students in getting that type of experience?
Right. How should they prepare students at the entry level if they want more field experience opportunities in policy analysis?
Right. So I've seen some interesting models that faculty have used. For example, I've seen faculty members do collaborations with community groups. There was one most recently that I was privy to, where the Environmental Protection Agency, they were doing these hubs with minority survey institutions where the faculty would partner with nonprofit organization or community organization to address an environmental disparity or injustice. And they brought their students as a part of the problem solvers to, one, real-life public health, because, environmental determinants are part of public health. They were understanding from the public health lens what the issues were, but they also, in partnership with the faculty, started to do exploration of what are different policy levers, either in other spaces like economic environment, educational environment, other social determinant environments to include as a part of their activity. And that partnership alone really gave them an applied method to experience policy through a lived experience in conjunction with meeting a public health and community health need. So that was an example of something that I think it was it wasn't evaluated, but that could be a model for supporting students getting that getting engaged in the process and getting them engaged early on to marry both public health needs with policy needs. And I think that there are a couple of besides CDC, a couple of different foundations that are doing that work who recognize that to achieve health equity in certain settings, it will require larger policy levers. And so I've learned from my own experience that practice makes perfect. So the application of having activities for students to really engage would be my recommendation.
We have someone who has offered more of a comment, not necessarily a question. And I guess I will defer to you your thoughts on the comment. So Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington is a great book on African American health disparities. The other subject that is examined, I'm going to assume within the book, is the unethical approach to establishing health policy. Dr. Jackson, do you have any thoughts on that particular comment?
I'm not as familiar with the book. I don't recall reading it, but I don't know. I don't necessarily have a reaction to it. I do think that what I didn't highlight in the presentation is the value that come to the table when you're doing a policy process. And sometimes the discussion and values have been partisan. It'll be Democrats think this or Republicans think that, but also a value proposition can be whether equity is important to you or whether human rights is important to you. And so as an influencer of the process, that may be something that this book talks about is through or adding to the lens of a health policy perspective, a value proposition and what must be included to actually create these policies. So, but I haven't. I must admit, I have not read the book.
I have another question. Hello?
Sure.
Oh, great, thank you. You mentioned that scientific evidence was clearly essential for driving policy change, and the National Institutes of Health is clearly essential for determining which type of research is being conducted. So I'm curious to know about how NIH is supporting social determinants of health research in hopes of driving policy.
I think there have been greater uptake in certain institutes within the National Institutes of Health, and I've found from that uptake of the institute's mission, there's a tendency to appreciate or adopt social determinants of health and wanting to know more questions or provide funding for that. And examples of those institutes would be the National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities, the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences within the Office of the Director, who's responsible for coordinating behavioral and social science across the NIH, and collaborate with institutes to do those types of funding announcements. Can I say that there's a very broad uptake of social determinant research at NIH? I would beg to think that the percentages are lower in comparison to other fields, but it is an ongoing activity in research area that is occurring. And I think that as I talked about earlier, policy for science is an area that people who would want to see more of that research would use that approach instead of just the science for policy. And as I mentioned earlier, policy for science is really how do you fund science and what is needed to actually, what policies are needed to actually do that type of science. And so those would be input, I would think, from outside influencers, like researchers, like research communities, like professional societies.
Someone asked a question regarding if you know of a clearinghouse for projects. And I'm thinking that they are referencing some of the projects that you had mentioned earlier after the question about how faculty can prepare or link students with opportunities in public policy. So do you know of, hopefully I'm getting that right. I haven't gotten any clarity from the person who asked the question, but so do you know of any
You're correct.
Of clearinghouse? Okay, thank you. So Dr. Jackson, do you know of any clearinghouses for projects, as you previously mentioned?
I'm not aware that there are any clearinghouses, but I think that there are, there tend to be college internships for different levels of students, and some of them, they won't call it specifically policy. It may be, in some cases, they'll say evaluation, and that term, evaluation of federal programming or evaluation of federal policy. I think the AEA has a website with a list of both resources, training, and internship opportunities for students to be more engaged in the public policy space. Another organization that it's escaping me at the moment is, and it's more of a science agency, but Research America, they sometimes have a calendar of events, whether it's seminars or information to share about science policy in particular. And then AAAS, which is the Association for the American Advancement of Science. They are the largest scientific organization that advocates for science, so they have a policy component and do fellowships, but I think the fellowships and internships are mostly for graduate level students, not undergrad. But those are a couple that come to mind, but I'm not aware of there being a one-stop shop for that.
Thanks. That's very helpful. I appreciate it.
Before we move on to the next question, please, if you would, if you are not asking a question, if you could put yourself on mute just so that we can minimize some of the background noise, so it will be easier for us to hear both the questions and the responses. Thank you. The next question, Dr. Jackson, I have, well, not me, but I'm relaying, is, does the NIH have grant funding available for for policy analysis projects?
Not that I am aware of. The NIH does have an Office of science policy, but I think most of the activity that they do for policy analysis is internally, and I don't think that they fund that or send grants out to have that done externally. But that brought to my attention another tool if you're specifically interested in scientific disciplines and how they're funded is the NIH Reporter. It's a database that houses all of the funding grants, and they categorize those grants based on key terms, year of award, and it's an extremely great resource when you're trying to identify what in a particular area of interest and how NIH is supporting it, which is, can aid in framing a policy question or addressing a policy problem.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. So I think that is probably going to be the last question that we have. I want to end by just letting you all know some of the things that we have going on for SAAPHI coming up. I'm not sure if everyone on the call is aware of who SAAPHI is, but just as a brief introduction, SAAPHI is an affiliate of the American Public Health Association. We are a nonprofit 501c3 national public health organization comprised of researchers, physicians, and health advocates dedicated to improving the overall health of African Americans. The organization promotes and utilizes research to inform scientific knowledge, program development, and policy decisions. If you are not aware, this year we will be celebrating our 25th anniversary in our pre-conference in November in Atlanta. And this is really a celebration of our past, our present, and our future, and really celebrating excellence and, that our SAAPHI members have in research leadership and advocacy. So if you are planning on attending APHA, maybe come a few days earlier and really celebrate with us so you can learn more about SAAPHI, the history of SAAPHI, as well as other opportunities to engage. Upcoming, as far as future webinars, we do have a webinar that will be hosted by our Mentoring and Professional Development Committee that will take place on April 26th at 12 p.m. More details will follow, and this will be in partnership with Partners in Health, and this will be focused on global health and practice. We do also have some upcoming policy webinars to follow up with today's webinar with Dr. Jackson, and we'll be focused on writing for policy and then practice-based policy and advocacy in action. Again, there are always opportunities for involvement with SAAPHI. If you are not a member, or even if you are or are not a member, I would encourage you to get involved. We have various committees. Our conference committee meets first Fridays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our finance committee, first Fridays, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our mentoring and professional development committee, second Mondays at 1 p.m. Eastern. Our public relations committee, second Fridays at 1 p.m. Eastern, as well as our science and policy committee, who hosted this webinar today on the third Thursdays at 8 a.m. Eastern. At this time, I want to thank Dr. Jackson for her time and her input. I know that I personally have learned a lot, and am really eager to go back through your slides and do a deep dive of what we've discussed here. And again, if you will, just share more about SAAPHI. If you have other questions, feel free to email Dr. Jackson. If you have more questions about SAAPHI, feel free to email us. You can check us out on various social media outlets. We're on Facebook, Twitter. We have an Instagram. We also have our website. So we are looking for ways to get engaged and get moving. So we are happy to have you. So thank you all for taking this time to be with us this afternoon. Dr. Jackson, I don't know if you have any parting words, but you're free to share those if you do.
I don't, but I all. I really enjoyed the question and answer session, and it sparked some questions that I have of my own of how to even improve the work that I do for the next generation. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
My pleasure. And yes, the slides will be made available, are actually available in the handout section of the webinar, but I will also send that out via email for you all if that's something that you are interested in having. So again, thank you all for your time. I think that you all will have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you on April 26th for our Mentoring and Professional Development webinar with Partners in Health. Thank you all.